Thank you. Other comments and questions, please? Yep. Thank you. Sorry, it's hard to see everybody.
Mark Fisher. I'm a molecular biologist at the University of London. I think there's been a lot of talk about networks. One of the biggest networks we're in is Europe. It's also an issue that actually divides the political parties, in terms of their interactions or their willingness to interact with Europe. I wondered how the panel saw our collaborative ventures in research developing with Europe in the next decade or so.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. Who would like to have a go at that?
Sure.
Go ahead,
I'm happy to start off. You mentioned the political party stance on Europe, and obviously they vary according in Europe in broad terms. But in terms of research, there's less difference than I think you'd imagine. So if you looked at the European election manifestos in the run-up to the European election, and there's quite a bit in the Conservative manifesto about the European Research Council and making sure it's autonomous and reforming the framework program. So there's fairly good consistency across the parties around European research policy. And with budgets tight across Europe, the European budget is, I'm sure, going to try to be squeezed by various different groups. But research is one of those areas where in the next budget, I think there's a push by many places in many countries to get a larger slice of the European budget on research. In the next framework program, the debates around that are going to be really important. That the European research community, and it is there, but it's not as coherent as the UK research community, for example. I think it's really important that various partners and associations and affiliations across Europe kind of get together to make sure that there's a positive vision for European research. And there's been a lot of top-down reports recently on that, about the European research area, but I think there needs to be a bit more of the bottom-up engagement from the science community.
Yes, please.
At this point, I put on my UKRC for Women in Science hat that Gordon was referring to slightly earlier. What I see as an opportunity in terms of interacting with Europe is that across Europe there are very different attitudes to incorporating women into science work and supporting them accordingly. Some are far better than the way that we work within the UK. Some, sadly, are somewhat worse. And one benefit I see of working with cultures that differ in the way that they choose to involve and support women in science is that good practice will show itself to be beneficial. And I would hope to see the good practice that is currently being established in certain European countries being shown to be something that we should be adopting here. In fact, I'd go further and say that I would like to see some of the quotas that are being adopted in terms of female representation at, for example, board level, adopted here too. That way that we can be certain that we are able to network effectively, we are speaking all the different languages and all the different cultural approaches that Europe can bring for us. And I think that's the only way to make sure we have a network that is hugely effective rather than simply competent.
Wendy, right?
Yeah, interestingly, we do very well out of the European Research Council. And we've been very encouraged by how many bids are coming from academics in the UK. But actually, we thought we could do better, in fact. So I think there's room there for more ambitious bids to the ERC. I mentioned in the presentation the knowledge and innovation clusters, the KICs, the Barroso's baby, which I don't know, it must survive. We wondered actually a year or two ago if it would actually come to fruition, but it has. And Imperial, I know, have just won their bid. I don't know if you're at Imperial, actually, bid for a KIC. And part of the criteria is to collaborate, I think, with at least one private sector organisation and definitely a university in Europe, and I can't remember which university Imperial has collaborated with in their bid. So there has been an increase in collaboration with European institutions, a greater interaction with European initiatives. But what I find very interesting, and I discovered this only relatively recently, is of course there still is, but there has been a very different culture across Europe when it comes to knowledge transfer and commercialisation. And it's only very recently that in Spain, less recently in Germany, but I think in Italy as well, it may even still be the case that academics were not allowed to engage in commercialisation activities, actually not allowed. And therefore, we're at very different stages at changing academic culture, or at least, university strategies, put it that way, when it comes to commercialisation. Again, it does kind of expose that divide where we are more like the US, or at least we're aspiring to be in terms of commercialisation activities, whereas a lot of fellow academics in Europe are only just emerging from a culture which did not encourage commercialisation activities.
Okay. Just could I add one small point to that, and that is, having recently read one or two Conservative Party documents prior to the election, including one on energy, it shows no signs at all of what one might call the UKIP wing of the Conservative Party being particularly dominant. And my own intelligence on this is that despite some of the very anti-European rhetoric one gets from the Conservative Party, they're likely to engage rather well and in a relatively sort of cross-party way with the opportunities that different European programmes, including the ERC and the Framework Programme, do offer to British researchers. But Nick, you wanted to come in as well again.
Just briefly on something Wendy said about the European Research Council, and we're very, as you say, we're very good at both winning grants. But I think what's an interesting indicator is about researchers who win an ERC grant, about where they decide to go with it, because they can go anywhere in Europe with it, and they come to the UK. By and large, there's a net inflow versus outflow. And I think that's, and in terms of looking at indicators of the health of the UK research base, I think that's a fairly good one to keep an eye on. And so going forward, we need to make sure that those real high-quality researchers across Europe are wanting to take their ERC grants and be in the UK with them.
Very good, thank you. Good. Somebody just here, please. Yes, just next to you.
Hi, I'm Gabriel Rosser from the Uni of Oxford. It goes without saying that a large part of the innovation network, or the network in general in academia, is made up of PhD students. But the large majority of policy is understandably made by people much higher up the chain. I just wondered if you had any comments more specific towards the role of graduate students. Should we be getting involved in this kind of discussion, or should we keep quiet and do the work in the background?
Well, you're visibly not keeping quiet.
You're here.
Who'd like to take that?
Well, from my perspective, I think you certainly shouldn't keep quiet, and you shouldn't keep simply pressing the buttons in the background for the benefit of supervisors. I think, in fact, you're the people who probably have the most innovative ideas, and you should make a point of establishing how valuable those ideas are. And the more your supervisor considers them to be too far-fetched, the closer you probably are to something worth following. I do know that there is now far more encouragement for people who are currently postdocs, for example, to think in terms of their own career development and going into business for yourself, developing your own research and innovating, perhaps through spin-out, possibly simply by going into partnership with somebody who's already established, is a perfectly good way to do that. Maybe we should put more emphasis on training for self-employment for PhD students and postdocs than we do currently.
Nick?
Well, absolutely engage in these debates. I think I've been really heartened, in terms of the stuff we've done around the election, that many of the people within the audiences for our science debates and then others were early career researchers, and people across the spectrum with an interest in science and engineering. And the reality is, it's the future of their careers if they're going to be wanting to pursue their research in the UK. So I think it's obvious that it's engaging in these debates early on is important. And I think there are more opportunities now, and hopefully there's a culture changing within academia about supporting PhDs and early career researchers to take experience within government through either shadowing schemes or through there's various opportunities through the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology to get engaged in these debates and kind of widen the horizons beyond the ones that are just within the lab.